Welcome to the debate. You watch a truly elite table tennis match, right? And from the outside, it presents as pure, unadulterated physics.
Oh, absolutely. It's just applied geometry in real time.
Exactly. The violent spin of the ball, the severe angles, the relentless metronomic back and forth, it all appears, entirely binary and exceptionally clean. The ball hits the table, or it doesn't.
Right? You win the point or you lose the point. It presents as a machine operating at maximum efficiency. But that outward cleanliness is incredibly deceiving.
Yeah, it really is.
We project this idea of a perfectly ordered, highly rational mind onto athletes performing at that absolute elite level.
Which completely falls apart when you look closer at a historical figure like Marty Reisman, right? The legendary ping-pong hustler. Suddenly that pristine geometry just shatters.
It gets messy, fast. Super messy. We are no longer observing just physics and biomechanics. We are staring into a deeply complex, incredibly chaotic internal landscape. So today, we are exploring the psychological architecture of obsession and supreme talent.
A very light, easy topic for today.
Oh, obviously. We're using the Internal Family Systems Framework, or IFS for short, to deconstruct the upcoming Josh Safdie film, Marty Supreme.
Right, starring Timothée Chalamet. It's a character heavily inspired by Reisman's extreme life.
Which is wild. And Safdie's cinematic universe is honestly, the perfect testing ground for this theory.
Oh, without a doubt. His films operate as these rigorous clinical observations of characters functioning under the absolute extremes of psychological pressure.
Right. And that extreme pressure forces us to ask a fundamental question about the nature of this level of achievement. When we see someone reach supreme status, when they become an undisputed, epic-defining master, is that greatness fundamentally a triumph of what IFS calls protector-led success?
Meaning driven by an unbalanced, monopolistic psychological defense mechanism.
Exactly. Or, on the flip side, can true supremacy only be achieved through self-led excellence, which is driven by internal integration and flow?
The ultimate question of elite performance.
Right. And my position today is that extraordinary, boundary-pushing greatness is inherently unbalanced. It strictly requires the extreme, sacrificial drive of the protectors, specifically the total dominance of a psychological part we can call the champion manager.
And, well, I'll be taking the other side. True sustainable mastery is exclusively a product of the core self. And that protector-driven success you're advocating for, it's merely a brittle facade masking profound internal vulnerability.
A brittle facade? Okay, well, let's hear it. Lay out your self-led theory.
Gladly. I absolutely stand by that. To understand why protector-driven success is a structural illusion, we have to define what self-led excellence actually entails, both neurobiologically and psychologically.
Okay, break it down.
So in the IFS framework, the self is the undamaged core of a person. It's characterized by curiosity, compassion, and, a grounded presence.
Sure, sounds very zen.
It is. When an athlete is operating from the self, they enter what sports psychologists call flow. Flow is a parasympathetic state. The nervous system is regulated. The prefrontal cortex is fully engaged, allowing for immense creativity and rapid pattern recognition.
Without triggering the panic button.
Exactly. Without triggering the brain's threat response architecture. An athlete driven by the self is deeply invested in the mastery of a skill, not the desperate possession of a title.
But can they actually win like that?
Yes, because they haven't anchored their fundamental human worth to a win-loss record. Because of that structural separation, they can observe a mistake, adjust their mechanics, and play the next point without their internal foundation completely collapsing.
Right.
That is the only mechanism that produces sustainable greatness.
Look, that sounds incredibly healthy, I'll give you that. But history's greatest anomalies are rarely healthy. To grasp the sheer magnitude of what it takes to become a Marty Supreme, we have to look at the psychological mechanism IFS refers to as blending.
Blending. Right.
Yeah. Blending occurs when a protective part of the psyche floods the nervous system with so much intensity that it physically and emotionally bypasses that core self you just described.
So it essentially takes the wheel.
It completely hijacks the executive function. In an elite athlete like Marty, a single manager part executes a total architectural takeover of the psyche. This champion manager doesn't just want to win, it fundamentally restructures the athlete's reality so that table tennis is no longer a sport.
It's life or death.
Exactly. It becomes a load-bearing pillar of their existence. When Marty is down 2 sets, the champion manager doesn't register the situation as, oh, I am losing a game. It floods his system with the exact physiological response of, I am dying.
Which sounds exhausting.
It is. But this manager builds a psychological fortress, believing entirely that value only exists in supremacy. Without that terrifying life or death internal pressure, without that literal survival instinct taking over the paddle, the mind simply will not force the body to push past standard human limitations.
I mean, I see the logic, but the cost is just...
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on how this fuel actually functions. You're looking at the toll it takes, but let's examine the raw output.
Okay, let's look at the output.
Protector-led success is fundamentally fueled by a profound fear of the abyss, right? The terror of becoming ordinary or meaningless. Think about the biological override we sometimes see in humans, like the classic example of an adrenalized mother lifting a car off her trapped child.
Right, hysterical strength.
Yes. In a moment of sheer panic, the brain bypasses all muscular governors and safety protocols. It is a catastrophic stress response that produces a superhuman physical result.
But that's a temporary emergency response.
Exactly. Now, imagine taking that exact emergency biological override and applying it continuously over a 20-year professional career.
That's horrifying.
It calcifies the nervous system. It is excruciating, but it is the only psychological propellant capable of achieving the escape velocity required for supreme status. Intrinsic joy and curiosity are wonderful for maintaining a steady baseline, sure.
They are essential.
But they do not possess the sheer kinetic violence necessary to push a human being to practice a single topspin stroke until their hands physically bleed.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
All right, go ahead.
Your analogy actually proves the flaw in the protector model. The human nervous system was not biologically designed to run on a 2-decade emergency override.
Well, no one said it was designed for it.
Right, but when a system runs entirely on synthesized panic, it doesn't just produce greatness, it demands a catastrophic exhaust mechanism. In the IFS framework, when the psychic pressure built up by this champion manager becomes too overwhelming, the system spawns what are called the firefighters.
The firefighters?
Yes. Firefighters are impulsive, extreme parts that rush in to forcefully extinguish the unbearable anxiety when the manager's control starts to slip.
Wait, let me stop you right there. I want to make sure I am grasping the actual causality here.
Sure.
I understand a manager forcing an athlete to practice for 14 hours a day to avoid the pain of losing. But you are suggesting that the erratic, self-destructive behavior we see in these prodigies, like the classic Josh Safdie chaos, the gambling, the erratic relationships, the wild arrogance that acts as a firefighter?
Exactly.
That seems completely counterintuitive. How does deliberately blowing up your personal life or acting out in public extinguish the anxiety of a table tennis match? Walk me through the actual logic of that mechanism.
It is counterintuitive from the outside, but structurally, it makes perfect sense. The champion manager creates an internal environment of crushing existential terror. The athlete feels like they are constantly suffocating under the demand to be perfect.
Okay, sure.
So when that internal pressure reaches a breaking point, the firefighter steps in with a radical solution: distraction through external chaos.
Ah, by creating a bigger fire?
Exactly. Creating a massive, tangible problem in the real world, like gambling away your tournament winnings or starting a volatile public feud. It's actually easier for the brain to process that than the amorphous existential terror of being unlovable.
Wow. So they sabotage themselves to feel a different kind of stress.
Yes. When Marty engages in incredibly eccentric or frivolous behavior, he is generating a massive dopamine spike. That chemical rush forcefully redirects the brain's attention away from the manager's anxiety. The firefighter extinguishes the internal panic by starting a massive external fire.
It's a distraction tactic.
Right. This is why when these chronically protector-led athletes finally win the championship, you rarely see pure elation.
You see them collapse.
Yes. They don't feel happiness. They experience a fleeting, exhausting relief that the system hasn't been annihilated. That is an engine of mere survival, rapidly approaching structural failure.
Okay, well, if we accept that the firefighter acts as an emergency pressure release valve, we have to investigate what the entire system is so desperately trying to protect, right?
The core vulnerability.
Exactly. What is at the center of this architectural fortress? IFS calls it the exile.
The exile. Right.
Behind the blinding speed of the paddle, behind the calculated arrogance and the entire mythos of the Marty Supreme persona, there is a wounded, isolated part. The exile is the lonely kid standing behind the ping-pong table.
The kid who just wanted to play.
Yes. If you are listening to this, think about the physiological dread you might feel right before a massive performance review at work, or the imposter syndrome that knots your stomach before public speaking.
We've all been there.
Right. Now scale that everyday anxiety up to a global arena where your core identity is constantly interrogated by the public. This exile learned very early on that it was completely invisible to the world unless it was winning.
Which is a tragic way to live.
It is. But it holds a deeply polarized reality. It maintains the pure, childish love of hitting the ball, but it is utterly suffocated by the ruthless need to dominate so it won't be discarded. This friction between pure craft and desperate survival is what creates the spark of genius.
You call it genius, I call it a meltdown waiting to happen.
But we have to acknowledge our complicity here. We, the audience, demand this pathology. We flock to characters like Marty Reisman because watching someone abandon all societal moderation to live and die for one singular obsessive passion, it vicariously fulfills our own repressed desires to break out of our balanced, predictable lives.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the sheer devastation of that dynamic?
I mean, I acknowledge the cost, but
You are framing this friction as a productive triumph of human limits, but it is fundamentally a tragedy. By allowing the champion manager to completely lock the exile away for its own protection, the psychological system ensures that the athlete remains entirely and permanently isolated.
insulated, maybe?
Isolated. The Marty Supreme persona becomes a suit of impenetrable armor. Consequently, nobody in the real world is actually interacting with the human being inside. They are only interacting with the monolithic defense mechanism.
But that mechanism is what wins championships.
Sure, the athlete is surrounded by adoring crowds, yet the core exile remains entirely unseen and unloved. Because the system is terrified that showing any softness or authenticity will compromise their competitive edge.
Right, because it would.
But the psychological literature we are drawing from points to a profound truth here. A brilliant public victory orchestrated by the protectors is very often a silent, internal failure of the soul. The system has built an empire so dazzling that it guarantees the true self can never emerge.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because history repeatedly demonstrates that the emergence of the true self, as you define it, often marks the immediate decline of the athlete.
Decline? How so?
This brings us to the ultimate IFS knot of this framework. What happens when the game ends, or when the athlete tries to heal? The source material explicitly references the thematic tension in the film Whiplash regarding this exact dilemma.
Ah, Whiplash. The ultimate debate on toxic greatness.
Exactly. In the brutal reality of elite performance, internal peace is a highly destructive luxury. If Marty were to undergo what IFS therapists call unblending, if he successfully stepped back, healed his exile, separated his core self from the supreme title, and found genuine inner tranquility, the psychological mechanism driving his greatness would collapse.
It wouldn't collapse, it would just transform.
No, it dissolves the emergency override. The moment table tennis becomes just a game again, rather than a matter of psychic survival, the athlete loses that vital fraction of a second in reaction time. They lose the willingness to suffer indefinitely.
So you're saying they have to stay broken to stay good?
Yes. Unblending from the title absolutely brings personal peace, but it fundamentally terminates the era of world-bending performance. The edge is permanently gone.
I come at it from a different way. You are assuming the edge relies entirely on desperation.
Because it usually does.
Let's look closely at the stark contrast in the aftermath of these two states. What actually happens to the psychological architecture after the peak is reached? Protector-led success, as you've meticulously described, leaves the individual completely empty.
They still have the trophy?
But the manager is exhausted from holding up the sky, the firefighters are burnt out from managing the crises, and the system immediately needs the next fix of victory just to stave off the exile's returning pain. It is an unsustainable cycle of neurological addiction.
I never said it was sustainable. I said it was required for supremacy.
But self-led success, however, leaves the individual fulfilled. When the kinetic energy originates from the self, from a profound curiosity about the limits of the craft itself, reaching the peak brings deep satisfaction. But more critically, true supremacy is defined by resilience.
Resilience, okay.
How does the system handle a devastating loss? If a self-led athlete loses on the world stage, they experience disappointment, but they update their mental models. They analyze the geometry of the table, adjust their strategy, and return.
They brush it off.
Exactly. If a protector-led athlete suffers that same loss, the entire system shatters. The foundational load-bearing belief, I am only valuable if I win, has been violently disproven by reality. The protector model is entirely too brittle to be considered true supremacy. One crack in the armor and the athlete collapses into ruin.
But it is exactly that profound brittleness, right? That structural refusal to accept a reality where loss is possible. That is what forces them to win so frequently.
Out of sheer terror.
Yes. The psychological system literally cannot afford to lose, so it leverages every microscopic drop of physiological resources to ensure it doesn't. To synthesize my stance on this complex dynamic, the awe-inspiring, relentless drive that manufactures a cultural phenomenon like Marty Supreme relies entirely on the absolute monopolization of the psyche by the champion manager.
At a terrible cost.
It is a sacrifice. It is the conscious, or perhaps unconscious, trade of internal peace for external historical perfection. The protector-led model is the necessary, agonizing crucible of genius.
And to synthesize my perspective, I maintain that true historical supremacy fundamentally stems from the self. Operating in a sustained state of flow, fueled by intrinsic joy and an investigative curiosity regarding the sport, allows an individual to master their craft sustainably.
Without the burnout.
Exactly. It proves that a human being can dominate the world without existing inside a calcified, anxious defense mechanism. The protector model certainly produces blinding flashes of brilliance, and frankly, it makes for phenomenal cinema.
It really does.
But it remains a structural tragedy of profound isolation.
Well, look, the tension between those two realities is precisely why Safdie's characters remain so deeply hypnotic to analyze. We can certainly both acknowledge the profound, almost terrifying complexity of the human mind when pushed to these absolute limits.
Terrifying is definitely the right word for it.
There is a deeply compelling psychological landscape generated by the collision between an untainted original love for a craft and the desperate primal necessity to achieve dominance.
It is the ultimate human friction. The biological imperative to protect oneself, going to war, with the psychological need to freely express oneself.
Absolutely. The internal family systems framework provides an incredibly rich vocabulary to explore this, not just in cinematic characters, but, in observing our own internal protectors, managers, and exiles in our daily lives.
We all have them.
We do. And it leaves us with a lingering question drawn directly from the core of our material today, one that challenges the very geometry we thought we understood at the ping-pong table.
What's the question?
If you were forced to choose between being the undisputed best in the world but living in a state of constant suffocating anxiety, or being perfectly adequate and entirely at peace, well, which part of your psyche is actually making that choice?